It's an attempt to help mankind define, understand, and assimilate the nature of the chaotic processes of conscious and unconscious development in both the collective and the individual. Better than food, man. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Better Than Food Book Reviews. I'm your host, Clifford Lee Sargent. Great to see you as always. Hope you're doing well. Get that coffee. How's it going? Good to see you. Just thought I'd drop a thick piece of analytical psychology on you this morning. Today is The Origins and History of Consciousness by the German Jungian psychologist and philosopher Erich Neumann, published in 1949. Whoomp. Now that is a big book. This is a major book in the field of analytical psychology, or Jungian analysis, which was created by the Swiss psychologist Carl Jung, whom I've reviewed a few years back. I reviewed A Modern Man in Search of His Soul. So I came across this book through Craig, an exceedingly helpful friend and patron, who, in my discussion of Camille Paglia's Sexual Personae, mentioned this text. Thank you very much, man. And if you'd like to join us on that, the link is below. I'm reviewing it chapter by chapter. I'm late on this next one because I was finishing up this guy, actually. But Sexual Personae was heavily informed by this book, so it's relevant. The YouTube channel NEXUS Void posted a comprehensive summary of this book in a series of videos in a playlist, which I will link below. They were very helpful and informed this review. I highly suggest you check them out if you are reading or are interested in reading this book. It's, where do you start with this thing? This is a book that you could probably study for about 10 years. Of course I didn't get everything in it. There's the amount of people who do. It's not quite as heavy as reading something like Being in Time by Heidegger, or Phenomenology of the Spirit by Hegel, or Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. But we're getting there, It's dense. It's a heavy tome. I am not traditionally educated in psychology at all. This is a very basic introduction to an extremely dense piece of writing. I'm sure I've made mistakes in this review, and so if you spot one, I'd appreciate it if you could correct me in the comments, so thank you very much. But even though it's out of my comfort zone, I thought it was so impressive, I had to tell you about it. I think you're going to love this, if you like the literature that I review. I may be opening a gigantic Pandora's box for you, in the nature of reality, psychology, and history. That's the best case scenario, for me at least. That's my intention. This is a very, very deep rabbit hole. Neo. So Erich Neumann was a student of Jung's in Zurich in the 30s. And not only a student, but according to Camille Paglia in this speech she gave on Neumann, the transcript for which is linked below, became his anointed intellectual heir, and Jung himself wrote the foreword for this book. So what is The Origins and History of Consciousness exactly? Well, obviously it's a book about human consciousness, but it's about how it develops within the individual and in the collective, in humanity itself, and the similarities and developmental stages between the micro and the macro and how they correlate, approximately. The nature of the chaotic processes of both the conscious and the unconscious. It's an attempt to help mankind define, understand, and assimilate the nature of the chaotic processes of conscious and unconscious development in both the collective and the individual. It's pretty heavy. Chaotic because these archetypes often have two sides diametrically opposed, right? Light, dark, yin-yang, sky, earth, male, female style. For example, the archetype, perhaps his most famous archetype, the Great Mother, is both benevolent, good mother, and the devouring Medusa of the unconscious, right? The mother figure in myths and goddesses, in religions around the world, often has that dual nature. Gods such as Astarte and Marduk and Tiamat need more of them stimulatacs. Quit being a bitch and pill me up. Marduk commands it. A big cheers if you get that. Ultimately, it seems to me that the book is an attempt to relieve psychological suffering, something we're experiencing a great deal of these days, which is why I'd like to tell you about the sponsor of today's video, BetterHelp. It is a very stressful time here in America right now, and all over the world, I'm sure. We're dealing with all sorts of psychological stress, whether it's issues due to economic factors, cultural, political, geopolitical, so we need tools for taking care of ourselves. Some of the tools I prefer would be getting enough sleep, definitely, critical, eating properly, exercising, meditating, and another tool would be therapy. BetterHelp's mission is to make finding therapy more affordable and accessible, which is helpful because finding a therapist could be potentially difficult given the slim options in your area, especially if you live somewhere rural, which admittedly sounds very nice these days. However, finding the right therapist in person might be a challenge. And unlike many things these days, they make finding a therapist easy because it's online, it's remote, and by filling out a few questions online, BetterHelp can match you with a therapist in as little as just a few days. And they make it easy to get matched with a therapist. There's a link below in the description. It's betterhelp.com/BTF. Clicking on that link helps support the show, but it also gets you 10% off your first month with BetterHelp, so you can try them out and see if it works for you, and I sincerely hope it does. And because finding the right therapist is a little bit like dating, as if you needed more challenges of that variety, I know, I get it. But if you don't initially fit with your therapist, which is a common thing in therapy, you can switch to a new therapist at any time at no additional cost, without having to worry about health insurance or who's in your network or anything like that. No worries. So if you're struggling right now, and let's be honest, who isn't? Please consider online therapy with BetterHelp. And thanks again to BetterHelp for supporting the show. Again, the origins and history of consciousness is about how you and I experience the same stages of psychic development as all of humanity itself. Neumann's aim is to define and help us understand the complex and sometimes paradoxical developmental processes of the psyche, not only in individuals but in cultures and humanity at large, right? He demonstrates this theory by mapping out the process of these stadial developments by highlighting and explaining the recurring myths, symbols, religious narratives, and archetypes that manifest in cultures around the world throughout human history. It's a theory of how consciousness inside us comes to be, right? All the while building on Jung's work, his mentor, exploring the unconscious and the conscious, though not necessarily agreeing with everything that he wrote. Like Jung didn't agree with everything that Freud wrote. Freud thought that all neuroses led back to sexual repression, and Jung thought everything was more complicated than that. And there was a major split-off. So Jung was interested in symbols and mythology, and developed his theory of the collective unconscious, and split with Freud and started analytical psychology, right? Where Freud's method is psychoanalytic theory. Regarding Neumann's observations, the book is so vast, so enormous, it's staggering that it could be written by one man, But it was. This guy must have had an off-the-charts IQ. So why would Neumann write a book of this size and scope, right? What does Neumann think is at stake here? Well, from the introduction, the relation of the ego to the unconscious and of the personal to the transpersonal decides the fate not only of the individual, but of humanity. So what's at stake? Well, just the fate of humanity itself. No big deal. Oh, okay. And I think he's right. By transpersonal, Neumann means something beyond the individual, like Jung's collective unconscious. Now, none of this is scientifically demonstrable, right? It's all depth psychology or analytical psychology, Jungian psychology theory. Nevertheless, I find it fascinating in its complexity and rigorous anthropological, mythological, and religious scholarship. It's very impressive even if you believe none of it. I don't like to accept things on face value. I'm trying to consider the arguments against this line of psychological theory, but I continually find increasingly interesting levels or depths to these theories that make it difficult not to be sucked in, right? He writes in the chapter on the separation of the world parents, we must emphasize that the symbolism of the myths which helps us to understand the corresponding human stages is not philosophy or speculation. The work of art also, the dream in all its meaningfulness, rises up in the same way from the depths of the psyche and yields its meaning to the discerning interpreter, though often enough it is not grasped spontaneously by the artist or dreamer himself. So while it doesn't seem real, Neumann would argue it is, right? He doesn't think it's philosophy or speculation. And that's something to pay attention to. What was interesting is it's not as obnoxiously impenetrable as a lot of philosophy. It really seeks to make itself understood. Neumann really seems like it's not dumbed down, but it's also seeking to be understood. You never get you get the feeling while you're reading it that it's all overwhelmingly dense, but this is the difference. If you were to take any one section, any series of pages, you feel like you could probably get it. Like if you reread it a couple of times. Like it's not so... There's no one section that is so vastly incomprehensible that you're just like, I don't even know what I just read. You can pretty much follow the whole thing all the way through. He is seeking to be understood. And that is a really strong sign to me that he might not be correct all the time. Well, he's almost certainly not correct all the time. It's all theory. But he may be more correct than not. So I'm paying attention to that. Neumann wants to be understood, sincerely, right? There's a sincerity to him that you don't find in a lot of philosophers, it seems. But that's just me, That's my impression. So the book is divided into two parts. Part one is the mythological stages in the development of consciousness, and it's divided into three subsections: the creation myth, the hero myth, and the transformation myth, which deals with Osiris in Egyptian mythology. It's the shit, and it's my favorite part of the book. And it's referencing Wallace Budge's The Egyptian Book of the Dead, which is on my shelf and I can't wait to get to. So much cool stuff in there. I can't even go into it. Just the myth of Osiris and Horus, and lots of dismemberment and self-fecundation. It's a good time. Phallus stealing and what have you. So here in part one of the book, you're going to find discussions on various myths and archetypes, such as the Ouroboros. The snake eating its tail, the perfect circle representing infinity, no beginning or end, symbol of eternal cycles, eternity and also unity before separation and differentiation, right? When the self and world are fused, before the sky is the sky and the earth is the earth, they're pushed apart from each other, male, female, light, dark, before any of that. Primordial, right? Before time and space, eternity. Then you have, of course, the Great Mother, perhaps Neumann's most famous archetype, and he actually dedicated a whole book to her called The Great Mother, which you can find below. And both the positive version of her as the good mother, the nurturing mother, and the negative version as the devouring mother or Medusa. Yeah, that one, there's an endless sea of information about her. Then you have the hero, which represents our own personal development of the psyche. And you have the various parts of our psychic development, slaying the father and slaying the mother. You know, this, not literally, just, you know, these are referencing stages of psychic development. Yeah, take nothing literally in this book. Neumann emphasizes that several times. This is not meant to be literal at all. It might be confusing at first, but you'll see what I mean. It's symbolic, it's mythological, right? It's archetypal. So when he starts talking about Ouroboros incest, which is a psychological state wherein the ego is stuck, it's still tethered to the primordial unconscious, right? Don't freak out. It's referring to a situation in which the ego can't become its own person. And if you're thinking about Joseph Campbell, like Hero with a Thousand Faces, yeah, they were actually colleagues, him and Neumann. I read that ages ago, back in like 2011 or something. Campbell went off. You should read the PAGLIA transcript below. She notes where Campbell made a mistake, where Campbell kind of acquiesced, and Neumann did not. Then you have the world creation myth found within all cultures, the Bible, Greek. There's a colorful Maori myth of Rangi and Papa that Neumann relates in here. And he also references James Fraser in here and the Golden Bough, which I still have to read. And the transformation myth, which is the process of developing consciousness we all undergo throughout our lives. Again, yeah, Osiris, Egyptian mythology, all that good stuff. Part 2 of the book is called The Psychological Stages in the Development of Personality. This part focuses on things such as Neumann's concept of centroversion, which, put very reductively, is an inner harmonization of extroversion and introversion, the ego, the conscious, and the unconscious. And as Nexus Void in that video series below mentions, our connections to the archetypes throughout the development of our consciousness isn't static. It shifts, evolves, changes, right, depending on which stage of consciousness we're in. And sometimes you actually have to regress to progress. It gets complicated. There's a lot to it. Consciousness is also a product of the unconscious. As he says on page 298 here, the original unity chapter, which is part 2. Although consciousness is a product of the unconscious, it is a product of a very special sort. All unconscious contents have, as complexes, a specific tendency, a striving to assert themselves. Like living organisms, they devour other complexes and enrich themselves with their libido. We can see in pathological cases, in fixed or compulsive ideas, manias, and states of possession, and again in every creative process where the work absorbs and drains dry all extraneous contents, how an unconscious content attracts all others to itself, consumes them, subordinates and coordinates them, and forms with them a system of relationships dominated by itself. We find the same process in normal life too, when an idea, love, work, patriotism, or whatever else comes to the top and asserts itself at the cost of others. One-sidedness, fixation, exclusiveness, etc. are the consequences of this tendency of all complexes to make themselves the center. It's interesting. Jordan Peterson was also a big fan of this one when he wrote Maps of Meaning, I think, which I reviewed a while back, which you can see on Patreon. If you like Peterson, roll with it. If you don't let it deter you. For what it's worth, he was a very nice guy when I interviewed him, which is also in that review on Patreon. All of this is extremely reductive, as we're very short on time, considering how much is needed to fully flesh out the concepts in this book. This is a degree, right? Okay, this is a degree in the form of a book. Camille Paglia describes the book in that same speech. In this book, my personal favorite of his works, Neumann argues that each individual's psychological growth recapitulates the history of humanity. He charts what he calls the mythological states in the evolution of consciousness, the creation myth, the hero myth, and the transformation myth, identified with the Egyptian god Osiris. Yeah, so Sexual Personae by Camille Paglia was heavily influenced by the theories of Erich Neumann. Particularly, it seems his theory and archetype of the Great Mother, and the notion that consciousness is inherently masculine, even for the women experiencing it, while the unconscious is feminine in nature. I think this is a source of controversy for Neumann, maybe the biggest one, I'm not sure. Paglia also said kind things about what is considered his biggest contribution to analytical psychology, which would be his concept of centroversion. As I mentioned earlier, that kind of evening out, so to speak, both on the individual and collective level. It seems to me that Neumann also may have helped facilitate Paglia's theories of cycles in sexual personae, wherein she outlines the back and forth push-pull, yin-yang dialectic of the masculine versus feminine, and the unending war of the female Chthonian versus the Apollonian. As she says, Neumann also perceives deep cycles and repetitions, as do Vico, Nietzsche, and Yeats, so that history and nature become dimly analogous. And so if you're reading that one along with us, you'll definitely begin noticing the patterns between the masculine and feminine with Paglia. This book is considered part of the canon of analytical psychology, like aside from Jung, number 1. You'll also notice it heavily influenced the language and ideas of Jordan Peterson, especially when he was writing his first book, Maps of Meaning. The Great Mother, the fight with the dragon, the hero myth. Much of that mythological stuff is Jung and Neumann. Well, I mean, it wasn't created, the archetype wasn't created by Neumann, but Neumann famously expounded on the idea of the archetype. I think Jung paved the way, but Neumann was the one who really explored the Great Mother and made the concept, the archetype, famous. It's often a bewildering maelstrom of myths, terms, and definitions. It's confident in its assertions in a way that is perplexing, given one often feels as though you're wading through a swamp of gobbledygook psychological jargon with absolutely no empirical proof whatsoever. It's like a mangrove swamp with all these different tendrils reaching out into the water, just all these different directions you could go in. But then when it begins to form in your mind, when you get it, and you can recall things from your own life, from your own experience, and if you've lived for a while and spoken with many people and read many stories and been a human, basically, for a few decades, you're kind of like, geez, maybe he's right. Maybe I am being partially devoured by the Great Mother and not slaying the dragon as I should have. The book really is remarkable in that it makes one ask, how on earth does one man synthesize all these concepts and relate them to one another in such a formidable theory or collection of theories? It sometimes seems as if the height of intellectual progress was somewhere around the middle of the 20th century, and everything since has been a poor facsimile, or increasing near obsessive reverence for what has already been revealed to be genius. Their works, those of the mid-20th century, have grown in stature where ours have been revealed to be cheap derivations or imitations. But perhaps it's the cycles that all these intellectuals are talking about. But as Neumann discusses in the book, heroes, magnificent figures in culture, are almost always unappreciated in their era, in the era that they live in. It's only after time passes that the cream rises to the top, and the realization dawns upon the collective, finally, of how incredible these individuals' contribution was. The same goes for artists and geniuses of all varieties. They're not appreciated while they're alive, but after they're dead, they're recognized as geniuses the world over. Cold comfort, eh? This is in part because in the hero's journey, according to Neumann, one of the things the hero must do is actually go against the collective. This tends to make the hero, at this point in their journey, unpopular. Obviously. I would pay very close attention to the people who are being cancelled today. I would. The dialectical play between the great individual and the collective still continues today. For him, the only thing that counts is the extraordinary. He must conquer the ordinary because it represents the power of the old order that constricts him. But conquering normal life, which is the life of the unheroic, always means sacrificing normal values and so coming into conflict with the collective. If later the hero is honored as a culture bringer and savior, etc., this is generally only after he has been liquidated by the collective. The hero's mythological accession to power is only transpersonally true. He and his world of values may conquer and come to power, but often enough he never lives to experience his power personally. Who's the most famous demonstration of that hero myth? I mean, I know it right off the bat, but Jesus. It's a difficult, dense book, particularly for one with no psychological theory background, right? But it's fascinating to glide through as someone first becoming acquainted with these theories and archetypes. I can't even begin to convey all the depth in the next few minutes, but I just wanted to bring it to your attention and give you an idea of why you gotta read this damn thing, especially if you're into psychology or anthropology or mythology. Personally, while the Great Mother archetype is endlessly fascinating and mostly steals the show, in fact, Neumann dedicated a whole other book to her, link below, my favorite part of the book, personally, were the pieces on Egyptian mythology and the transformation myth. Egyptian mythology is so vastly different from Western Christianity, it's remarkable. So violently primal and in and of the body, and its relationship with the earth, endlessly creative. I think Christianity actually may have been inspired or lifted elements from the Osiris myth, the water to wine story, for example, or motif. In Egyptian mythology, the blood of Osiris falls into the Nile and transforms its water into wine, which is then offered as a sacrificial drink to him. I'm reading the Norton Critical version of the Old Testament right now, and what I didn't know is that the Bible is full of puns. Like all the names in Hebrew of these characters, they're actually related to the things that they do, right? It's all it's all quite intentional in its narrative storytelling. So if you don't know that, you kind of lose something. You lose quite a bit actually in the translation, but it's really interesting. Neumann was born in Germany, and when the Nazis rose to power, he took off with his wife to Tel Aviv in Palestine. Neumann saw what was happening in Europe and what took over. Something sinister rose out of the collective unconscious, and it was summoned using symbols and myths. And political parties, of course, still do this on both sides. They know the power of it. So this isn't bullshit, right? There are serious consequences to this kind of stuff. And the culture, our culture, assimilates these myths and symbols against their better judgment and starts running with them unconsciously. The platform that you're experiencing this video on, all these different social media platforms, they're a myth and symbol producing machine, right? This is all, anyway. Actually, think about the scope of it now is kind of freaking me out. It's a good book to read in order to try and understand what is happening around you, especially right now, and understand perhaps what you're part of, maybe against your better judgment, I don't know, or maybe not. The end of the book, and I hope you won't mind me reading it to you, is actually sort of a psychological and existential call to arms, basically, to try and figure this stuff out so we don't repeat mistakes. But only when the conscious development of mankind as a whole and not merely of single individuals has reached this stage of synthesis will the supra-individual Ouroboros situation truly be overcome, and with it the collective danger of the dragon. The collective unconscious of mankind must be experienced and apprehended by the consciousness of mankind as the ground common to all men. Not until the differentiation into races, nations, tribes, and groups has, by a process of integration, been resolved in a new synthesis, will the danger of recurrent invasions from the unconscious be averted. A future humanity will then realize the center, which the individual personality today experiences as his own self-center, to be one with humanity's very self, whose coming to birth will finally vanquish and cast out that old serpent, the primordial Ouroboros dragon. I don't think Neumann has an exact idea of what that'll look like, and neither did Jung. Few, if any, do. But in the wake of the events of the 20th century, with the Nazis' rise to power that Neumann personally experienced, he knew something had to be done. And I think that was a major catalyst for the creation of this book. There had to be some attempt to solve the problem of the collective unconscious rising to the forefront and taking over a culture in the worst ways we've ever seen. And this was his response. It will not look the same the next time, I guarantee you. And it can come from either side, right? In a way, this book is Neumann's attempt to save the world, to save humanity from itself. As PAGLIA put it, I regard him as an accomplished culture critic whose synthesis of art, history, and psychology offers a more promising direction for culture studies than the current approved academic models. And she also said, Neumann's manipulation of material is improvisational rather than schematic. There is neither moralism nor a political agenda operating in his work. I'll be rereading him. Better than food. Check it out. So you should read it. Well, if you're a fan of any of the intellectuals I mentioned in this review, definitely check it out. Jung, PAGLIA, Freud, Fraser, any of them, it's right up your alley. Coffee time. For those of you who are new, thank you very much for stopping by and watching. I take all of the names of the patrons on Patreon who are financially supporting the show, and for every review I pull out a name, and whoever's name I pull out I sent a hard copy of the book I'm reviewing, plus a bag of coffee, roasted by yours truly. And the coffee is delicious. Currently from Nicaragua. If you would like to get in on that and help support the show, I sincerely appreciate it. Thank you very much. You can click on the link below or go to patreon.com/books are better than food, and the tiers start at $5 per video. Please make sure you set a monthly limit if you're on a budget. And for becoming a paid patron, you'll also get access to all this cool stuff, including the Sexual Personae series I'm doing right now, which is a chapter-by-chapter review of every chapter in Camille Paglia's Sexual Personae. Thank you very much to all my patrons, and best of luck. Okay, here we go. TWM71. Thank you very much, TWM71. Really appreciate it. You're going to receive The Origins and History of Consciousness by Erich Neumann, plus a bag of coffee, roasted by yours truly, and I hope you love both as much as I. Cheers. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and hit the thumbs up if you enjoyed this, and always remember, bring a book wherever you go. All right. Thanks very much for watching. Take care of yourselves. Great to see you as always. Have a good night. Talk to you soon. Ciao.